Well, that was rather a disquieting set of suggestions. It seems as though for many of us, life is now the continuous performance of an archive, in addition to all the other social performances that constitute our normal experience. But I do want to try and use this moment to bring together some of the strands that have emerged from these 2 days of discussion, whilst also addressing what you presented, Leap. Because in some sense, I think the Shanghai session speaks to some of the, if you will, dilemmas that seem implicit in this conference and in probably the draft project generally. And especially because the conditions of immaterialization and of itinerancy, which you spoke of, they actually have the effect of throwing into question this whole business of how we engage with a location, what constitutes location today. And you'll see, of course, that there's the phantom of Mi Won Kwon behind what I'm saying. But I do think that in much that we heard yesterday and today, we're looking at this continuous question of how we renegotiate a certain commitment towards what you might call a cultural politics of place and an engagement, and the questions of belonging or citizenship that go with that. And on the other hand, there is some tension that I detect between presenters and audience in terms of an expectation that conforms more to an older model of what you might call the country report or the region survey. And I found that dramatized in the Shanghai session. It came up in Mexico, St. Petersburg, Hong Kong. But here, especially, even in the way the presentations were made, I felt that there was a certain conflict between bearing witness to a particular place and its multiple histories, whilst also speaking of everything that artistic and curatorial practice does in terms of also pulling away, having the freedom to pull away from those narratives. So I think that's something we might usefully think about in terms of, I think it was Kotemok yesterday who spoke of wanting to still retain a certain purchase on social irresponsibility. Right? So I think we probably need to look at these gaps between what you might expect of someone who seems to be working in a particular location and the way in which the notion of location itself is multiple, protean, versatile today, and how one's engagements with location therefore are going to be far more complicated than what might be expected. Yeah? And in the context of that, I want to also dwell a little bit on how it is that artists nonetheless work with questions of reclaiming and remapping public space, establishing, however temporarily, a space of public reason, and a space where unexpected social and cultural encounters and relationships might well be staged. So I'm wondering if two tropes, which I'll just throw into play for what it's worth, might help us here. One is, of course, and I refer here to a beautiful essay that Agamben wrote, which many of you probably are familiar with, called Profanations. And Agamben speaks of how the act of profaning is a way of reclaiming things that have been fetishized, that have been taken out of social currency and circulation and rendered into icons, monuments, scriptures, whatever it might be. So whether it was the work of Teatro Ojo yesterday and the way in which there was a reclamation of news, of official reportage, of the official account of events, and how that was rendered intimate and even painfully personal, whether it was that, or whether it was what Chini presented, a way in which through the ludic, through playfulness, one can address the mechanisms and the devices and the strategies of a totalitarian state. Or whether it was what we heard from Sto Dielet in terms of reclaiming prior histories that emerged from a totalitarian state, but which yet offered spaces of cultural activity that could be reclaimed, histories and narratives, forms of self-organization that could yet be restored for current use. I see all these as forms of profanation. And I would also apply that to what you presented, Lee, in terms of looking back at the hagiography of the party, the ideological idiom of portraiture, and how by unmasking and by rendering it festive, intimate, again, how one could profane it and restore it to even the space of the private, and how one can take back from the state that which has become ossified somehow, and to, by doing so, to also disalienate oneself, perhaps, from this sort of monumental history. So I just want to put some of these thoughts in play. I also want to maybe think about how many of these manifestations tell us something about an insurgent form of citizenship. Citizenship that disaffiliates itself from the protocols of a state and has much more to do with the production of relationships in the moment of social urgency. How does one form solidarities in such a moment? What can citizenship mean that way? And can one conceive it under the sign of insurgency? So those are some of the thoughts that I thought that we might just maybe use as reference points as we go forward. And with that, I really want to draw you out a little more on what you were saying today, and to ask if this is, whether you feel this strange pressure of bearing witness to a place whose exigencies and urgencies are changing constantly, and even as your own location changes. So how do you manage this contradiction, if it is a contradiction?
I have to learn about it. I think it's a matter of learning process of understand everything happens in time. So I think if we understand from the past that there's a logic of understanding of getting knowledge of how you learn and process it, and to give yourself this kind of social identity. And then nowadays, I think I have to learn it in a very comprehensive way. When I'm traveling, when I'm encountering with maybe just one person, so I have to learn that I have to ignore he or her nationality and ignore all these kind of cliches of what I understand. So I think it's a matter of understand how this kind of so-called constructed knowledge, constructed identity that no longer makes sense to me, that I have to really think how to adapt it to a person I could know better, so as a human being, rather than a person that already having so-called armor or something, that shield inside of this invisible shell that I could not conquer. And I think, this is something I try to do also with myself, with my work. And also, as I said, of knowing things in time, it's also about how we understand the world changes, that how much of this kind of world changes touches me, which is like, if you know the process of internet, that maybe every 3 to 5 seconds that there's a news delivered, you have to really know that, what that really means, what that going to be effective. I mean, sometimes the news can be timeless, especially with, touches with something or somebody's professional career in politics or in something else. That if we think about, what Snowden and Julian Assange told us about this kind of thing, that it's not about something we don't know. It's really about something. I mean, it's already there. It's already there. But whether we spend time to discover more, or to knowing the truth is what that really means today. So I think that's something very interesting. It's not about something that is black and white, but something really much more complicated than my experience. So I think it's with all kind of changes, with all kind of this kind of so-called information constructed world, everything become a little bit shaken at the moment. Everything kind of collapsed because, from this kind of thing that, there's a deep internet, there's something you don't know, but actually can be accessed somewhere else. This is creating something that, like a feeling of facing a huge universe you have no idea of.
Could we open it up to questions now?
I wonder how you use in your context, or what you understand in your context on the public sphere. Because I speak now as Europeans, not as Indians, as Europeans, we understand as public sphere a space of negotiation. In fact, it's a space of communication and negotiation, or opinion making. And as I learned you from how you speak, how Iris speaks, I think you use this notion in another way. Of course, all this opinion making, communication, it means somehow a media. In the past, in the beginning of that, what we can say, it's a public sphere constructed in the 18th or 17th century. It was the literature. There it started from literature. It started a so-called aesthetic public sphere. From this point, later, 100 years later, it was a political public sphere. But it took a long time to establish a kind of public sphere from, let's say, small communities who understand themselves as a public sphere, as a public. And public sphere, that was this kind of communication through books, through literal magazines. Of course, today we have the internet, and that's the space or the media you use for these negotiations, opinion makings, and information transport as well. That's why I ask you specifically as a Chinese, because your political background, the cultural background is very different. As I know from discussions with you and other people we know both together, we use this notion, public sphere, in a very different way. I just want to know from you in which way you use this notion and which kind of background, and is through the medias, through the internet, you achieve a similar public sphere as we understand from the West?
I sort of find your question very interesting, because I feel that there's a tension there. Because I guess that the space that you're trying to occupy has to do with the idea of the public that cannot be reduced to the public sphere of democracy, and not even to the public sphere of the ideals of Western democracy. There's a sense which is originary in Rome, where the public is the space where the right of the family and the paterfamilias is extinguished, and you're stepping into space that is defined by a different right. And this right is, of course, the right of the government, or the right of the community. And it is certainly interesting to think that in many situations, I think that what you were addressing is precisely that space. There's a sphere that, of course, has a certain legislation that comes from the fact that it's not my private space of security. Mm-hmm. And I gather that the wind in Beijing is the wind of a space that is, first of all, uncovered. Secondly, it is powerful, and it involves the danger of something called politics. I mean, I want to put it, I find it very inspirational in that sense. I mean, that rather than thinking that this is a space of dialogue, it is a space where there can be actually a huge hurricane. Sometimes the air is stiff and nothing is happening. But it is interesting to imagine that what we are talking about in relation to this issue is not to be identified immediately with the idea that there's going to be something like a Habermasian space, of dialogue. But this is the space of exposure where even the danger of violence can occur. And I think that it's interesting, beyond the question of cultural specificity, to think that those two notions of the public space actually collide. And many, even provocational artworks in places that we know, different places, are interesting because they are confronting as a public space where the notions of public sphere don't operate. But that doesn't make them less public. You see what I mean? I mean, there's a people, there's a structuring of power around the people. Simply it's not democratic in the formal European normal classical sense. But maybe that, I mean, it's the People's Republic of China, and this is that is what is the public in that sphere.
So I want to add a bit more of this so-called the public sphere. What I understood is really to get the public sphere that you need a rule.
Speak louder.
You need a rule to that a group of people should agree on the same rule, and especially with so-called the internet culture begins. There's lots of so-called this kind of public sphere that related to many of the issues that normally in the public you would not dare to touch. So there are communities. So there are certain kind of communities, and there are certain kind of different kind of public group of people that are existing. And it's becoming more and more difficult to understand, to follow, because these kind of people are only existing when you agreed on certain kind of things. So which is never existed in China before, I would say, before 1990s, because I think before that, you're still kind of gathering in a certain way that you have to have a personal, I mean, physical, personal kind of relation. And also all these newspaper, magazines, I mean, all these kind of things are kind of highly controlled by the government. So I think to have a certain kind of public sphere from the past was kind of top to down kind of idea, you know, like the media were playing the kind of a delivery of creating or inventing the public. But after the internet began, so the public invent itself by obeying or following on a certain rule, that people start to have this kind of free style or free zone or free understanding of, you know, what means the public. So, I mean, with that, I think it's something triggers another issue of how the government manages itself. I mean, there's a lot of contradictory issues. Like, for example, recently people discovered that our president's wife, she have a Twitter account. Then many people kind of attacking her in a way, saying, look, this is not allowed in China. How come you have a Twitter account? And this is something interesting, because I think this is not making things not to understand or difficult to understand. It's making things rather clear what that means, you know, as a person today on a certain level, that you're no longer having a special rights, and what that means, public, that could hurt everybody. And that no longer is the one who on top of something that deliver to the public also including you into it. So that's what I understand.
Perhaps I can also add something that, like as a comment, I would say this, as you said, the Habermasian space of the public. I think it's not something about culture. It's like a question of normativity and epistemology. And I would say it's important that it's not that this space is taking place in Zurich, for example, as such. Actually, we could also think about Zurich as a space which is where the public space is rather constructed in power relations. And actually, I think that's something that I or nobody work on. And you also discussed that firstly, some people are excluded from the public space, like, for example, migrant voices, and specific arguments are not possible, like talking about racism is not possible. So one could also think about the public, as Judith Butler has done in her book Hate Speech, that actually there is censorship, implicit censorship, like in the discourse of the majority. So it's not about like the explicit censorship where things can not be said, but even things you cannot think of, cannot conceive of. So, and I think it would be also interesting to look at this understanding of censorship in a public space like Switzerland, which is very often, especially defined as in contrast to China, where censorship is so obvious. And I don't want to like romanticize the situation in China nor like dramatize the situation in Switzerland, but like, how is it possible to bring this situation in connection and also compare it, for example?
Yeah, I also think we might expand the kinds of conceptual tools we are using. I think because many of us trained in a certain tradition, this Habermasian notion of the Öffentlichkeit is what occurs to many of us as a viable model. But like you just said, much like Athenian democracy, it has barriers to entry. Also, it's a very angelic representation of how social exchanges take place. And this might be the place to think of alternative models like Partha Chatterjee's proposal of political society. I mean, in, for instance, a society like India, where you look to the political for resolutions on a scale of subjects, from family law to land acquisition and how to challenge the state, how to challenge all kinds of predatory actors in the social and political and cultural arenas. So your notion of society is already politicized in a profound way. Whilst in the Habermasian model, you are trying to secure civil society in contradistinction to the state and its mechanisms. There's a much more complicated relationship to the political in many, many parts of the world. So I think we need to also expand our own notion of what liberty, what the right to expression, what these things might mean in such scenarios. So I think much of what we've heard over these last 2 days suggests that we draw away from this Habermasian model. So maybe that's one of the outcomes that we need to think about as we go along.
So to come back to this, like, because Switzerland is very often looked at as a model democracy, and something which is there in this model of direct democracy where people can vote about issues they bring up when there are 100,000 of signatures, is that another kind of the political is like totally neutralized. So I think something which we could think about is that really in this context of like so-called pure democracy, that other ways of being political are neutralized and not heard. So because people think, oh, we have our initiatives, we can do it there. There's a formal democracy, we can do it there. And it's really interesting, like many of the initiatives in this context of anti-racism and migrant movements that I was involved in, they were actually initiated by foreigners. A Greek anthropologist who was in Berlin, and he says, oh, you have this kind of initiative of deportation of criminals. Why don't you do anything about it? Or now somebody who is working for like bringing in migrant voices coming from Germany, father from Iran, who says, oh, nothing is happening. So it's really interesting that we can not only look at the model or the hegemonic self-understanding, but really at the realities of the power play or about the public. So that's also something which would be interesting to discuss.
I just would like to respond to you, Ranjit, what you said. I think that's correct that there are a lot of other, let's not say models, but understandings of public sphere which doesn't correspond or are not, how do you say, they don't fit together with Habermasian. Of course, I would also never say that the Habermasian model of public sphere is the only one. It's one and a historical one. It was very much criticized by a few American philosophers. That's true. The only thing is I question if we discuss, if we use these notions also in our context, what we work now in draft, we should be conscious about how we use it, or if there are other notions, how they are defined, or are there other words, or is it just another notion? And this thing I think we should work on. We have this discussion just now in relation to Chinese artists, people, because we had it already before, and especially with China, I got the impression that we are just using these words, these notions in a very, very different way. I also wonder, of course, very much how it is used in India, or is there is another concept. As a basic, I would say I make a difference between public space, public sphere. And in the public sphere, how we understand in the Western European communities or landscape, and I don't say it's the only one, of course, and it's not, I don't say it's the correct one. Their public sphere is very much the foundation of a democracy, how we understand in the West democracy, which is also another understanding than in other parts of the world, of course. So it's a very specific context where it comes from, and I wonder, of course, very much how it is in other parts of the world, because I have the one from the Western European ones. That's the origin where I come from and which I understand somehow. Then, on the other hand, of course, we have to know that this Habermas'an model is an ideal model. It's not the reality, it's an ideal. And it's an ideal how to work with. It's something like a Maßstab, how you say in English. A measure or a model you can follow. Yeah, that's all.
A funny tension between the geometrical character of sphere and square in relation to public. Yeah? And this might not be that banal, because it happens to be that the publicorum, and I'm talking about European concepts, was merely the space. Mm-hmm. It was simply the space of the populace. And that space was flat and square. So the idea, I don't know where, I would love to check how is it that that became a sphere. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting issue. It never crossed my mind that Petersburg and all the tradition of thinking on the emergence of the public sphere in Europe in the 17th and 18th century had that geometrical idea. But there, certainly, it had to do with the notion that it had to do with the change of media, because it has to do with the emergence of free press and the creation of the space of free circulation of ideas. And it is interesting that it has a spherical character, as if it is a point of irradiation. And certainly, I guess that something what you were saying has to do with the fact that there are many acts of what we are talking about in relation to the question of public interventions that are not about exchanges, but about gestures, that are about positions in the space and transgressions of the social order rather than exchanges, that are somehow visible in the market rather than involved in a democratic situation. And indeed, it's very stimulating. I mean, I really need to try to understand how that operates in opposition of this very difficult metaphor of the space of cyberspace, because cyberspace doesn't have a shape. I mean, it's a very, very peculiar thing that is a space that is not formalized, that doesn't appear to have any, it just has entries and windows. I mean, at one point I was thinking a lot about the idea that you jump through windows in a project of rent. But yeah, I would argue that it's not easy for many people, that it's not a cultural specific issue to identify public with the agora. Those are two things that are, in my mind, differentiated. That you constantly have an issue with the public that has no character.
Just once more, when I when I was confronted with this kind of public sphere, as I understand, in preparing the whole project draft, Gitanjali and me, we went to Hong Kong, and there was just the moving, it was still going on, the yellow umbrella moving. And on the streets there were posters, a lot of faces on it, and written over the posters, there was written, government, we are watching you. And this is exactly, that's what the public sphere makes. The public sphere, through negotiation, through opinion making, it has somehow like a control over the government. So the public sphere somehow is something like, how to say, the voice who takes care about what's happening in the government. That's the typical old, let's say, old-fashioned, not old-fashioned, the old tradition notion of public sphere made from the bourgeois people to have control over the government. So the public sphere is also something like a media to control the government, how we use it today. And this sphere, that's why it's also so interesting in the political sense or in the political notion of public sphere, it's also a media to control the power. And of course, this is more and more eroded. It's eroded, as you described, that as a media of constitution of the public sphere today is the internet, and the internet is, of course, controlled. And in China, even more than in other countries, but then also in other countries, of course, it's everywhere controlled. But that's what I mean. Then, so we are always have to take care and to erect again and again that what we mean, what is a public sphere. And it's always eroded by other power plays which happens in our world. And that's also what we mean by, let's say, to engage in this, what we call public sphere, or to have these debates, because the debates are also, that's what's happening in this public sphere. That's why we're talking about these notions. If I speak a little bit unclear, please apologize. I have often very much difficulties to speak, to find the right words in English, sorry.
The only minor caveat that I'll put in place, you didn't imply this, but often in discussions, I think we are also seized up. Our imaginations are so caught up with the internet and the condition of being online that we sometimes neglect to see that there still are flourishing people's movements and mobilizations offline in normal life. And even in situations during the umbrella movement, for instance, or certainly in Tunis, certainly in Cairo, about which we'll hear, you know, the telephone networks could be jammed, electricity could be cut off, you can't be online, and you still have public articulation in tremendous and compelling and persuasive ways. So I think we need to also keep that in mind, because sometimes I find that the bogey of immaterialization and online experience tends to take over our imagining of these questions. So that's just something to put in play. But we seem to have hit tea time, right? Fabulous. Thank you so much for this and for the discussion.